to wrap this up with fashion leaders and influencers, right? So fashion does have, like we saw, some pieces and some rules. There's some players as well, some players that help move fashion forward or help it stay put, one of the two. So so this next section we're going to talk about fashion leaders, and then in the next part of the lecture, the next tabs we'll talk about some careers, and you get to meet some people. So looking at the theories that we've just looked at, right? The downward flow, the horizontal flow, and the upward flow, for much of our history, the downward flow is where, what influenced that fashion movement, that downward flow. So it came from the top and moved down. And traditionally those fashion leaders were, royalty and world leaders and actors, right? People who had a platform where we could see what they were wearing, make an assessment of it, and then have it be imitated and copied, so that those at that lower spectrum are able to adapt that. So people of social, political, economic importance, both in the United States and abroad, were seen as the fashion leaders, and that's not necessarily the case now. The case now, when we look at the horizontal flow or the upward flow, there is definitely a different set of fashion leaders. While the downward flow recognizes that fashion leaders, people at the higher social stratifications, their styles trickle down, there is also that horizontal flow. And, you know, there are quite a few items of clothing that we wear that are named after fashion icons, after famous people. Not necessarily, well, I guess they were fashion icons because there's something named after them. And contemporarily, if we look at some of the stuff in here, the Rachel haircut from Friends, um, the Nehru jacket, the bowl cut that the Beatles wore. At some point, the Yeezy shoe gonna be on this list as well. But fashion leaders sometimes leave such a mark that their styles move from being a downward flow to being horizontal. So we trade back and forth. And you know many of these. Hopefully, if you're a man, you've tied a Windsor knot in your tie, and you know what a Nehru jacket is, and you've seen a pompadour. These were all things that are named after famous people, but have gotten to the horizontal flow stage where they flow in and out between groups, and no one group can claim that anymore. The other thing on here is the Wellington boot, the welly, right? So if you know, a hunter boot is named after the Duke of Wellington. So welly boots, those are things that are just, they're really just staples in the fashion world now, and they have that flow between the people on the higher spectrum of the socioeconomic class as well as people on the lower end of the spectrum. So we've looked at fashion leaders that were on the downward slope and on the horizontal slope, and we're going to wrap it up with folks that are on the upward slope. And athletes, musicians, and influencers are in this mix because oftentimes they did not come from a higher socioeconomic background. Now, there's the Kardashians, there's some influencers that have, but athletes and musicians oftentimes came from the lower spectrum of the socioeconomic class, and they've adapted. They just adapted their style, and their style then becomes the style of the upper classes. So just you know interpreting things that in a different way than the upper social classes have done in the past is often what athletes and musicians and many influencers do. Their influence is really not just limited to some sparkly thing, some shiny object that they can get, right? It's multi-layered and multifaceted, and their wardrobe, their personal styling, all those are all the things that make up their influence. It's just not what they wear and who they wear, but how they put it together, right? The styling piece is the other piece. And that is where the downward slope has influenced folks on the higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum. There are reasons that folks follow fashion, and it's in part because fashion, like I said, is an outwardly expression of our personal likes and interests, and people follow fashion in part because of admiration, right? They always talk about copying is the sincerest form of flattery, right? To admire, to feel better about themselves. So if they have some insecurities, to develop their style and their courage through adapting the styling of someone that they admire. Um, although some people are ambivalent about fashion, like I don't like the shop, but they love getting something new, right? And so those are some of the reasons that we follow fashion, but we really fashion is it's an outward um, it's an outward self-expression. So people can tell a lot about you before they even know you based on what you're wearing and how it's styled. So while the nature of fashion may be changing, the speed uh, is difficult to predict, especially in the times we are now. The environment is difficult to predict, but the speed is difficult to predict as well. And there are, even though there's widespread technological advances that bring new products to market, there are a whole host of factors that keep us from buying them when we look at some of the environmental factors, and there also is a whole host of identifying accelerating decelerating factors that keeps fashion from moving forward or moves fashion forward. So in the next part of the lecture, we're going to dive into the careers um, that help support um, that help support the theories that we just talked about.